Right, just okay, I'm hoping everybody can see that, but hello, I'm going to make a start. So my name is Rachel Sawyer. I am an educational psychologist, and thank you to everybody who's logged on this afternoon at the end of term to come and listen to me talk about my doctoral research. It's really lovely that people have been so interested. So hopefully someone will find something useful from today, or just be interested to hear about what I did my research on. So just to give you a little bit about me, I have just qualified as an EP last summer from the University of East Anglia, and I'm working at Suffolk County Council, and my research, as hopefully you'll be able to see on the screen, was titled Parents' Views on EBSNA, or Emotionally Based School Non-Attendance, a solution-based exploration into successful reintegration. So hopefully a topic that some of you will be either interested in or familiar with if you've joined today, and certainly one that seems to be quite topical at the moment. So yeah, I'll get stuck in. So my aims for this session is to share a very brief overview of my thesis research that I completed last year. I'm aware we've only got sort of half an hour or so today, so it might be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but please do feel free to ask questions or get in touch with me afterwards. I'm more than happy to discuss this in more depth if anybody would like to. But I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what my research entailed, including my rationale or my methodology. I'm going to explain and share my research findings that came out of this, and promote consideration of professional practice in this area through the spiral principles, which is essentially a way of my findings is sort of a model that my findings sort of leans itself to. So hopefully this will all make sense later on, and yeah, it will be useful in your own practice or in your sort of reflections and discussion within your services. So what is EBSNA? So EBSNA stands for Emotionally Based School Non-Attendance. I mean, this is a term that has got lots of different variation across different services or over history. You might have heard it referred to things such as school phobia, school attendance difficulties, school refusal, and more recently things like emotionally based school avoidance. So I chose this particular term because it aligned with other research studies that have recently taken place in this area, but also because of the nature of the difficulties that I was looking at as part of my research. So these are children who are regularly not attending school because of their difficulties, rather than just avoiding or having difficulties with sort of attending particular lessons or parts of the school day. But essentially it can be defined as high levels of stress, anxiety, or negative emotions that regularly prevent children or young people from attending school. And Berg and colleagues in 1969 developed a set of criteria that sort of we still use today to almost define EBSNA, if you like, although it was referred to as school phobia at the time. But it's can be broken down into difficulties with school attendance, the negative emotions associated with school attendance, the presence of sort of antisocial behaviours or towards adults that try and promote attendance, and the parents' knowledge and best endeavours to engage them in school attendance. So that's the really key one that we're going to be thinking about today. EBSNA is understood to affect at least 1 to 2% of all school-age children, and this was something that was discussed by Nuttall and Woods 10 years ago now, but I would anticipate actually that number is probably a lot higher at the moment. Especially since COVID, it seems to be something, particularly in the work that I'm doing, that coming up again and again. But it's not currently consistently acknowledged within the legislation. The Department for Education frequently refer to things like persistent absenteeism, which is actually a bit of an umbrella term for lots of different reasons behind that absenteeism. So it's really hard to sort of quantify how many children might be experiencing this difficulty. But we do know that the responsibility for school attendance is and has been always for a long time now that with the parents and carers, which means that they can be liable to prosecution if a child isn't attending for whatever reason, and that's really important to consider when thinking about the research that I've done. It's actually interesting in the case of EBSNA that children that parents can actually be liable to higher fines with EBSNA, because if your section 444 of the Education Act suggests that if parents are aware of their child not attending school, then they could be liable to higher fines than those who aren't aware of their child's non-attendance in cases such as truancy, for example. So it's really interesting to think about it as a concept, and to actually that lack of differentiation can be really important in terms of the literature. So thinking about the literature, when I went to go and initially explore the topic before I conducted my thesis, a lot of the research out there at the moment is thinking about causation and what are the factors that drive EBSNA or EBSA, whatever term you prefer to use. So our understanding of EBSNA has changed significantly over time. So back in the 60s and 70s, attachment theory was really prominent in this area, thinking about the child-parent relationship and actually viewing school phobia or school attendance difficulties as representative of a psychiatric difficulty rather than sort of representative of other needs. But research has definitely evolved over time and now much favours a multi-systemic approach to understanding and support. So the idea that there are lots of different contributing factors from lots of different systems that might contribute to EBSNA, and actually each case can be viewed really individually. In the 1990s, a model called the functional model of school refusal was proposed that some of you might have heard of, that essentially considers the role of push and pull factors in developing sort of attendance relating difficulties, and these can be factors in the school environment or the home. And this model was really fed into our modern day understanding of the role of school-based factors as well as home factors in developing attendance difficulties, but also the role of SEN and any other difficulties that the child might be experiencing in school. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more today. Nuttall and Woods in 2013 completed some case study research looking at this multi-systemic perspective, and they interviewed young people, EPs and parents in two separate case studies to consider that multi-systemic role of reintegration. And they found that there was a huge importance of implementing support across different systems, including the home and the school environment, in order to promote children's reattendance into school. And this has led definitely in the literature to increase accountability for schools and professionals to be doing more in order to support children that are experiencing EBSNA. Ingle, Havage and Hain produced what they called a school-based framework, which talked about the different roles and responsibilities that schools should be taking when promoting positive attendance, including parent-school relationships. However, the evidence, at least anecdotally, is suggesting that this is still not really happening in practice to some extent, that although the literature is really advocating for this multi-systemic approach and this school-based accountability, we're not always seeing it on the ground. Recent research from Not Fine in School, which is a charitable organisation designed to support parents of children with school attendance difficulties, actually found in their research that parents continually feel abandoned and isolated when experiencing this difficulty, that the threat of legal fines and legal intervention is really unhelpful, and that professionals aren't including them in the support for attendance difficulties, which conflicts with the ideas that are promoted by the literature at the moment. So when I was doing my literature review, I delved a little bit more into this, and I noticed that actually many local authorities are promoting or considering that school accountability through creating sort of information in the form of toolkits. And I've put on the screen on the slides some that you might already be familiar with, but there's lots more out there, and some of them are really, really helpful. So there is some recognition out there that there is more that schools and professionals can and should be doing in order to support this difficulty on the ground. However, some quite historic research now from Archer and Malcolm, both in 2003, found that schools and professionals, both in local authorities and outside of local authorities, still believe that home factors are the root cause, suggesting that actually, although they're putting things in place in school, they're not believing that they have any accountability towards the contribution towards the behaviours. A thesis research by Rachel Brown in 2018 looked at parents' views of children who had experienced EBSNA and when then educated in a specialist provision as a result of having to leave their current school. And they suggested that actually that previous research, even though it was 20 years old, is probably still quite valid, because lots of parents felt judged, blamed, had a lack of communication with professionals, and it might still centre around that idea that this is a home-based issue rather than something that schools can contribute to as well. And considering the fact that there's a lot of blame placed upon parents and the role that the legislation plays in promoting parental accountability towards this difficulty, there's little research actually exploring parent views on how we can support the factors behind EBSNA, but also those practical recommendations, the so what, if you like. So my research aims to address this gap by including the parent voice and experience to think about how we can support reintegration going forwards. So these were my research questions that were developed as a result. So I wanted to look at what form of support are parents currently accessing when they're supporting EBSNA. I took a retrospective stance when I completed my research, similar to other studies in this area, looked back at with a what works solution-focused approach, thinking about what did we do that was useful as professionals, what could we do more of, and basically what needs to change moving forwards. So my research questions looked at the support that was accessed, what about this support was found useful by parents and families, what professionals could actually do more of, and then obviously I had to consider the role of COVID-19 when I was doing my study. I was proposing it around 3 years ago when lockdown was happening and lots of children weren't in school at all. So I thought it'd be really interesting to look at how the pandemic might have impacted or changed the support available or accessed by families and what impact this had. So my methodology, I employed a critical realist perspective, although I won't go into too much depth about what that means. But essentially, although the parents that I was working with, I understood that they all had very unique and individual circumstances, and that EBSNA is itself very heterogeneous in that respect. I also understood that we are all living in the same society under the same education system. They were all liable to the same education acts, if you like, but also trying to promote the same outcomes. So that was sort of my thinking around that, is that I was hoping to use individual experience to promote a shared next steps for our profession. I used a sequential mixed methods design. So I used an online questionnaire that had both open and closed quantitative and qualitative questions, followed by semi-structured interviews. And the idea of this being sequential is that the participants that took part in the questionnaire were then invited to share their details if they wanted to go on to complete interviews, which some of them thankfully did. As I said, I was exploring retrospective experiences using a solution-oriented lens. So I wanted to look at parents of children who had experienced progress following EBSNA support. So children who had experienced a period of non-attendance and then made progress in some way. And I purposefully kept that definition of progress really open because I realised that that would look really different for every child. So for example, out of some of the parents I interviewed, there was one child who was going back into school full time after a period of non-attendance, but actually their well-being still wasn't where they would want it to be. He was still finding things really difficult. But another child, for example, was only going in for a few hours a week, but their well-being had much improved. So depending on who you ask and how you measure it, progress can look really different. So when designing this study, I made sure to keep that really open so that I was exploring different types of progress and what helped to make that. And this contributed to the idea of practice-based evidence. So Nuttall and Woods talk about, although as EPs, we all really like to think about evidence-based practice, actually sometimes our practice in itself can inform next steps. And that's what I wanted to keep at the centre of this study. So my phase 1 online questionnaire, in total, I ended up with 28 respondents that met the criteria. I did have to exclude some, unfortunately, because like I said before, I wanted to make sure that what I was looking at was really solution focused and focusing on that progress. So it would have been really easy to use this research as an opportunity to be quite negative about what wasn't happening or what was missing in terms of support. But I really wanted to keep it strengths based. I wanted to keep it practical and think about what we're doing well and what we could do more of or do differently. And in order to do that, I had to really focus in on those participants that had children that had made some kind of progress. So unfortunately, the ones that appeared not to have made progress or had actually declined in that time, I had to exclude, which was a real battle for me at the time, actually, when I was going through my data, but also highlights the potential for future research in this area. I think there's a lot of parents out there that are experiencing these difficulties and want opportunities to share their voice. And unfortunately, I couldn't hear all of them as part of this research, but it was really, I think that's important to note. The questionnaire did confirm the heterogeneous nature of EBSNA that the literature kind of indicated already. Over half of my participants indicated more than one contributing factor, and the contributing factors that were discussed by participants included things like unmet SEN needs, lack of support from school, as well as mental health difficulties. So quite broad factors that were in itself quite difficult to sort of pinpoint any one thing that was contributing to their child's difficulties. 82% interestingly reported that their child had a diagnosis or an identified special educational need. The majority of these reported that their child had a diagnosis of either autism or ADHD, but also there were difficulties such as specific learning difficulties, sensory and processing needs, and sleep difficulties as well that was cited. Interestingly, 65% of those with a recognised special educational need didn't have this recognised or identified or diagnosed until after the attendance difficulties had started, suggesting that actually this SEN was perhaps not being met effectively whilst they were in school, and at the time that the attendance difficulties started, that's sort of almost too late perhaps for some of these children, which is quite interesting to think about in terms of sort of the reasons behind non-attendance. So the phase 1 questionnaire looked at the support that parents were currently accessing. So I asked parents to indicate if they'd accessed different types of support and then how useful they'd found it. The most commonly accessed support, unsurprisingly, were school-based professionals, so things like the class teacher and the head teacher and the SENCO, as well as online platforms of support such as social media. And health services, interestingly, were quite highly accessed by parents, so things like GPs and CAMs. Less than half of parents reported accessing an EP or any other local authority education service, and very few had accessed services such as family support practitioners, social care or parenting groups. But even though school-based professionals were the most accessible, the research on this occasion didn't indicate that it was actually the most helpful, that they were actually cited as one of the more unhelpful forms of support, including social care and health services as well. Educational psychologists and other local authority education services were actually found to be the most useful, which is really interesting considering that less than half of the participants actually accessed these. The school SENCO and family support practitioner were then rated as the second most helpful forms of support, which suggested to me that some kind of professional knowledge of SEN is really important when supporting families and children experiencing EBSNA. And then there were some really mixed experiences with online forms of support. So some parents found it really, really useful and others spoke quite negatively about it. So that was quite interesting finding as well, considering how accessible the online forms of support are. So my phase 2 interviews aim to explore these findings in a little bit more depth. So I developed an interview schedule with the consideration of the questions that I'd already asked, including questions on the role of the EP. So how were they accessed and how were they useful in a sort of solution focused way, as well as thinking about how participants felt about online based support if they accessed it, and the impact of COVID-19 as well, because a lot of parents in the initial questionnaire showed mixed views about COVID-19 as well, so I wanted to explore that a little bit deeper. I did 5 semi-structured interviews in total. The parents were 3 girls and 2 boys, all mothers that took part. 3 of them had an ASD diagnosis, although I wasn't necessarily looking for a relationship between EBSNA and ASD on this particular occasion. I thought it was interesting to note that there was quite a high prevalence in the people that participated. And then I analysed my interview transcripts using Braun and Clark's for reflexive thematic analysis. So this was my thematic map that was then created after all of that lovely analysis, and hopefully it's quite small on the screen, but hopefully everybody can see it, and obviously you'll have it to look back on. But you can see along the top were my 6 themes that were created as a result of my findings, and then under each one is the sub-themes that are associated with each, and then sort of links between them. So what I'm now going to do on the next couple of slides is take you through all 6 themes to just give you an overview of where they came from and how I defined them, and perhaps some implications that come from each one. So the first 3 themes were these: supporting parents, promoting sense of belonging, and including and informing parents. So under theme 1, there was the importance of supporting parents both emotionally and logistically really shone through. Every parent that I spoke to described the challenges that their child's EBSNA brought to the wider family as well as to them and their child, and the difficulties that caused sort of general family life, and the need for them to access support, be that from professionals or from someone like a family member or a friend, to just make sure that they're getting that emotional support they need. And that was something that sort of came through as really important and actually lacking for some parents at the moment. That support network was really vital to them feeling able to manage their child's difficulties. And part of that was the access to parent support, which you can see was another sub-theme there. So parents actually on multiple occasions cited that the most helpful form of support accessed was from that of other parents. So parents that have been through it themselves, or were currently experiencing at the time, or themselves had a child with identified SEN, sharing successes, sharing tips, if you like, signposting each other information. That was suggested to be really, really useful. And lots of parents accessed it on online platforms with some mixed success. So this is where I explored a little bit about the online forms of support that parents accessed. And some talked about how this was really positive, but others spoke quite negatively about this, said it could be quite a negative environment that breeded quite a lot of distrust between them and the system. So it highlighted an area in which actually the parent-to-parent support is really, really useful if it's delivered in a safe, structured and more positive environment, and that perhaps online forms of support don't always offer that in the way that parents need, although lots of them also cited it as really, really useful as well. And then the last sub-theme under that first theme of supporting parents was understanding parents' needs. So one participant in particular springs to mind when I think about this sub-theme, who herself had ongoing health issues and was finding it really hard to be there and have the capacity to support her child with her attendance difficulties as a result. But once the school stepped in and organised for support workers to become available and help the parent at home more with the day-to-day living, she had more energy and time to spend with her child and work together with the school to support her attendance, and she was then attending on a full-time basis. So it really highlighted that actually sometimes working with the parent to think about what they need in order to be there for their child is really important. And this comes under the umbrella as well of things like advocacy services and considering parents' ability to access meetings and understand the language. So ensuring that they're really sort of their needs as well as the child are understood, so that you can really support the family as well as the individual child. Thinking about theme 2, so promoting children and young people's sense of belonging, will hopefully be something that's quite familiar when we think about EBSNA, but really promoting that idea of the child's sort of sense of inclusion in the school through the sub-themes that I've listed underneath. So parents talked about the need for a really positive relationship-based approach, the idea of having a key adult in school and someone that can advocate for the child's needs in lieu of the parent. So many parents spoke about themselves as their child's main source of regulation or their main advocate, and how having someone in school who could also support the child's regulation and advocate for their needs being really important to help transfer the child's trust back into the school environment. The need for person-centered approaches and in gathering the child's voice was highlighted as really important. So making sure that the child felt included in any action plans that was made on their behalf. Things like part-time timetables were only reported to work as long as the child was fully on board and part of that action planning process, and making sure that the child's interests and strengths and sort of their things that motivate them were really included in that action planning. And then the final sub-theme under this theme was around promoting psychological safety. And a lot of parents, this talked about the importance of prioritising well-being over academic learning. Many felt that the pressure to just get them back in full time was the thing that the schools were focusing on, when actually the child wasn't ready or happy or safe to go back on a full-time basis, and something more gradual or doing more learning at home might have been more interesting and beneficial for these families, and that actually the child was in school but not able to engage due to that feeling of not being psychologically safe. So that's that was quite an interesting takeaway to think about where the priorities are and how we can work with families to make sure that we're working together, not against each other, to achieve that. And then the third sub-theme here on this slide was informing and including parents. So similar to theme 1, this was very linked with the idea of making sure that parents felt supported. But this particular theme was more centered around the idea of parents being included in action planning, feeling informed, and that they can make these informed decisions alongside professionals rather than having things done to them. And a big part of that was maintaining trusted relationships. So as I said, online support was something that was cited as having an impact on parental trust in the system, but also a lack of consistency, a lack of understanding of what the school was trying to achieve, having different priorities. All of these things were cited as something that could break down trust between school and families, and the need for this trust to be in place in order for collaborative action plans to be developed. And in order for this to happen, parents really felt that their views had to be gathered and utilised effectively. So many, as I said, felt that they were their child's biggest advocate, and that listening to the parents' needs was a way of gathering the child's voice, because often the child only felt comfortable to share their true views with their parents at home. And so making sure that parents are included in conversations about their child, but also have a real chance to feed back on the support that might be put in place and to share ideas, was cited as really important by parents to make sure that they felt included in that process. And then the final sub-theme under this one was signposting and navigating services. So many parents, as I'm sure you'll appreciate in your own practice, felt overwhelmed by navigating the system, as they referred to it, even those that had experience of it or worked in education themselves. And many felt that they didn't have the information that they needed in order to make decisions and to access the support required at this time. And so many felt that it would be really helpful for schools, local authorities or other services to have that information on more accessible to families, be that through online forms or through different referral pathways, to make sure that that information was there for families to use and to access, and maintain that trust a little bit further, if you like, between schools and local authority services. So these were then my themes 4, 5 and 6. So raising awareness of EBSNA was theme 4, with many parents feeling that actually this was improving, that over the last few months, particularly with COVID, people seemed more understanding of the concept of anxiety, particularly since that time that had been spent out of school. But a lot of them talked about how this needs to go further, and how this awareness and understanding of EBSNA was really important for that early intervention. Parents talked about how difficulties needed to be supported a lot earlier, before the attendance difficulties became entrenched, and that need for that early intervention right at the first signs of anxiety. And in order for this to take place, they talked about professionals needing to actually have an understanding of what those signs were. So accessing training in EBSA or accessing training in the signs of anxiety, so that they can really support these needs as they appear, rather than when they become sort of a barrier to attendance. Additionally, having an awareness of SEN was talked about as really important for school staff, in order to effectively manage the needs, so that it doesn't get to the point where the child feels anxious or overwhelmed in their environment. So that was something that was highlighted as really important by all parents, but also something that seems to be improving. So that was quite reassuring to hear. Accessing external professionals was theme 5. So all parents that I spoke to as part of the research accessed some kind of external professional when supporting their child's difficulties. So that really highlighted, just like the literature said, that need for a multi-systemic approach, that actually we need to be involving in professionals in different systems depending on the child's needs. And that was seen within the interviews. So not all parents accessed the same professionals. Some accessed EPs, some hadn't. So it was really interesting to hear that depending on the child's needs, different professionals were referred to in order to support the difficulty that was happening on the ground. And for some children, that was a home-based difficulty, so it might have been things like social workers or family support practitioners that were referred to, but others had things like educational psychologists, specialists in ASD, specialist advisory teachers, and advocacy services, in order to make sure that the support that they were getting were really tailored to their situation. And lots of them spoke about the specialist knowledge that these professionals had really having a significant contribution to the action plans that were created, and having that multi-agency involvement was really helpful for them. So that highlights the importance of having a multi-systemic approach. However, parents only talked about this as being helpful when they felt included in the plans and the conversations that these professionals were making and having. So some parents talked about how the professionals were involved, but they didn't understand the reports that were produced or the language that was used, or they didn't feel like they were invited to the meetings that took place between the professional and school. And then they didn't perceive this involvement to have been as effective as the parents that felt that they were really included every step of the process. So that just highlighted the importance of increased collaboration with parents, even with the external professionals, so that that multi-systemic approach is really, really clear. But all parents talked about the difficulty in accessing services, which I'm sure will be a difficulty that's shared in a lot of places and a lot of services at the moment, and across both health and education. Parents talked about the long waiting lists and the complex referral procedures that acted as a real barrier to them accessing that early intervention that was mentioned in the previous theme. And this just highlighted the need to refer early, to identify those difficulties early on so that right professionals can be referred to at an earlier stage in the attendance difficulties, but also the idea of schools and local authorities having more information accessible more quickly, so that schools and parents can be doing more earlier on to support their child's needs without having to wait for that external professional support in order to do so, which was quite an interesting finding. And then my final theme, which actually has links across all the other themes, it didn't have any of its own sub-themes, if you like, but was lessons learned from COVID. So surprisingly, all parents spoke quite positively about the COVID lockdown. I think naively I went into this research kind of expecting people to have quite a negative view about that time, because for a lot of us it was quite stressful and anxiety provoking. But for a lot of these families, they saw it as a time of relieved pressure, if you like. Some of them talked about having their child back again, that the physical symptoms of their child's anxiety completely disappeared during that time because of the reduced pressure to attend school, which was really sort of lovely and surprising to hear. A lot of them talked about how the re-engagement with learning was really helpful due to the online learning adjustments that were made during COVID. So those particular children that had quite high anxiety about missed learning or accessing learning in the classroom in a big group was able to re-engage with learning through remote means, which made it just that little bit easier to go back when the schools reopened. They could engage in a sensory environment that worked for them. They didn't have the pressure of putting their hand up or being on camera. And that just seemed something that worked really well for some parents, that they spoke really positively about. Similarly, the remote building of relationships was discussed as really helpful. So during COVID, during the COVID lockdown, I'm sure you're aware that lots of schools were doing welfare phone calls, checks, video calls, letters, emails, and lots of these children that were not attending during COVID found that increased communication really beneficial. It was the idea of that relationship-based approach that was talked about in theme 2. And the idea of having that key adult in school and building that relationship to then have that adult waiting for you when you returned. And it was little adjustments like that that parents found really, really beneficial. And I think throughout all interviews, parents talked about the realization during this time that actually it was those little tweaks that could make a huge difference. It didn't have to be above and beyond provision, that lots of schools have the capability to put things in place. And it took something like COVID to realize what that might look like. And obviously, we've now gone back to relatively normal schooling since COVID, and schools are very busy places, but parents talked about whether or not the capacity to continue things like that would be really beneficial in supporting children that were out of school, such as offering online learning, online relationships and support going forward. So hopefully you might have noticed while I was talking that all of my 6 themes very neatly spell out the word spiral, the acronym spiral. So this kind of lends itself, if you like, to a set of principles that we could use when considering support for children and families with EBSNA going forward. So because of the solution focused nature of the research, all of the themes map really nicely onto practical recommendations for support, not just in schools, but with local authorities, with educational psychology services and other professions as well, things we can be considering when we're planning support for this population. So it's not like a prescriptive to-do list. It's not giving you list of things that you need to tick off a one-size-fits-all approach when supporting EBSNA. It's more a set of principles, as I said, to consider and inform your practice. And that's quite a nice thing that I hope will have come out of my research, is to make sure that all of these things are being taken into consideration when working with parents, when working with families, when supporting this difficulty on a multi-systemic approach. So obviously thinking about the need to support and include and inform parents, the principles when working with individual children in school, the information and knowledge that school staff might need in order to notice those early signs of EBSNA and refer on, and then getting involved with the local authorities and getting the right professionals in as early as possible, and all of those sub-themes within that act as sort of guides, if you like, to think about the types of support that we could be putting in place and the things we need to address in order to support this difficulty. So I've obviously talked about it as I've gone through, and I've just mentioned it there as well. But even though I just talked to parents as part of this research, it's really nice to think that these spiral principles, if you like, have implications across all the different systems. So it fits really nicely in with the literature that's already out there, that we need to be tackling this as a multi-systemic approach. So there are implications definitely for the individual support that children and young people might need, thinking about the person-centered approach and the relationship-based approach that's going to be really important on the ground in schools, but also the need to work with parents, maintaining their trust and communicating really clearly with them and including them in action plans. And this might include as well offering support either on a professional level or signposting them perhaps to things like parenting groups, community groups that might be able to offer the practical or emotional support that parents talked about needing in these cases. There's the need to think about how we address things in school, so perhaps giving schools the tools and resources to notice these difficulties earlier and refer on earlier, as well as provide more universal and targeted interventions for anxiety, both in primary and secondary schools. And then finally, thinking about the local authorities and the external professionals, there's implications in terms of thinking about how we access them, perhaps the development of better support pathways to make the process of assessing and identifying which professionals need to be involved a little bit smoother, but also the information that local authorities are putting out there to support schools and parents with that process while they're waiting for that support. So there's implications across multiple systems that I think was quite interesting to think about going forwards. So obviously with any research there's going to be limitations directions for future research, so I've very briefly put some of them on this slide. The top boxes relate to the limitations, so I'm very aware that it's a small participant sample and participants varied in their geographical area and they all had individual circumstances, and so there's likely that there are views of this population that weren't represented by this research, and like I talked about at the beginning, some of the parents that I couldn't include that were still, this was an ongoing difficulty for them, would have been really interesting to do some research that could have captured the voice of all parents, and perhaps that's something that we could pursue in the future. But I'm hoping that that sort of is a really nice starting point for thinking about what parents might be experiencing and what they might be finding helpful. And my hope would be to extend this research, if possible, to corroborate that with other parent groups, but also professional groups as well, and see if this is sort of something that is happening on the ground. I also realised that my recruitment probably could have been refined a little bit. So thinking about how I recruited my participants through professionals and through schools, as again, I wanted to really capture that progress and support the positive progress that had already been made. But again, I note that that's perhaps sort of excluding some participants somehow, and so it would be interesting to see if other recruitment methods would produce similar results. And then I note that obviously the child voice itself is not captured by this research, as other research has already captured, but it would be really nice as well to include that in some way in the future, as well as the views of professionals such as people who work in health services, schools, attendance teams, educational psychologists, to make sure that that multi-systemic voice is really well represented, because we've got all the little parts and we need to start bringing them together, really, as this research has highlighted. And then along the bottom, I've got a few ideas for some future research. So throughout, although I wasn't explicitly looking at this research highlighted the relationship between EBSNA and special educational needs, and the need to be thinking about how we support these better in school, and how this contributes to higher levels of anxiety. I know there's some fantastic research going on by other TEPs and at the moment that sort of delves into this a little bit further, and I'm really interested to see how our research links up together. I think it's a really big area that's gaining a lot of traction at the moment, and also the role of online sources in sort of either breaking down or promoting parental trust, thinking about how we communicate with parents and the type of information we're putting out there, and whether there's more safe and structured environments for parents to access that support. I think that's something that this research had both positives and negatives come out of, and I'd be really interested to delve into that a little bit further through the, and there's continual, as I said, this topic is really gaining traction at the moment, so continual research through things like action research, focus groups, case studies is something that I'd love personally to be involved with more in the future. But I think that other, as I said, TAPs out there are beginning to sort of take this on within their own thesis, so it'd be really interesting to see where this goes next. So I've already talked about them already, so I'll quickly skim over this. But my hope for the future is that the spiral principles, which are the been drawn for the themes in this study, can be used to develop training approaches or a model for schools and LA services to use, whether that's in individual casework or when designing whole school or whole organisation pathways and access to support. In terms of my research, I'm hoping to pursue publication and continue to share my research and maybe build on it if I can. And as I said, I'd love to extend it to gather professional views on the principles and how they might be able to be implemented on the ground. But yeah, thank you all for listening. I really, really appreciate everybody that's taken the time out of their afternoon to come and listen today. I've popped my email address, my Suffolk email on the slide. So if anybody wants to reach out and ask some questions or discuss this further, then you're more than welcome. I'd be really interested to hear from you. So I'm just going to stop sharing and then we'll see how many questions we've got. Oh, I've got some more questions. So somebody said, has this research been published? Is there a way we can access it? So that kind of already half answered that. So you can access my thesis through the UEA website, through the thesis repository, I believe, but I'm, as I said, I'm pursuing publication, so hopefully in the future there will be another way of accessing it. Did parents indicate a preferred term, or was it EBSNA? Actually, a lot of parents quite liked the use of EBSNA. When I talked about it in terms of my research, a lot of them had themselves understood it as the term school refusal. So there was some quite positive feedback actually about the shift in terminology, that actually the term school refusal was creating a little bit of misunderstanding about what the cause of the difficulty was, and so parents quite liked the terms non-attendance or avoidance to replace that refusal, which was interesting to know and good to know, considering that's the way the literature's going. Were there any peer contributors to causes and solutions to EBSNA as identified by your research? So yes, the role of peers, particularly in children with SEN, was highlighted to be really important, and the role of bullying was highlighted as a potential cause. Obviously, they talked about the research talks about the importance of considering lots of different factors that contribute towards EBSNA and not just sort of thinking about one cause. So there's lots of different ways of viewing it, but depending on what's going on for that child, it was really important to highlight what we could do in turn on the ground to support, and what schools can be doing to think about the different needs each child has. So came up as really individual within the literature. Is there a reason why you use the term EBSNA instead of EBSA? So this is a question that comes up again and again, and actually in practice they're used very interchangeably. The council, the local authority that I work in, use the term EBSA, and that's probably the term on day-to-day that I use quite often. But I use non-attendance in this particular study, firstly because a lot of research that I was looking at in this area had also used that term, so I wanted to align with them. And there were also authors that talked about the importance of holding a really non-judgmental stance, and terms like avoid and refuse suggest that there was an element of choice in the non-attendance, and so some of the literature is advocating for non-attendance because it kept it sort of factual and less judgmental. So that's why I chose it on this particular occasion. But as I said, in practice, they're often used quite interchangeably. There's a few more questions, but I'm just really aware of time and how I've gone over a little bit and I can't get to them all. But thank you everybody all for listening and for the lovely comments. And as I said, if anybody wants to email me with further questions, then you're more than welcome. So thank you.